I call the honourable member for Fraser.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, today's matter of public importance is on the need for market-based reforms and the need for strict and transparent budgeting. I want to start today by talking about the importance of market-based mechanisms in dealing with environmental challenges. Now, this used to be a pretty controversial area. In fact, the first person to raise them was none other than that controversial figure, George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., who suggested that we might deal with environmental challenges by putting a price on the externality. He faced objections, but the objections at that time came from the left. It was those on the progressive side of politics that took some time to come around. But from the very beginning, as you can see in such important documents as the honours thesis, the member for Flinders, the right was signed on. The right understood intuitively that this was a good way of harnessing market-based mechanisms, that the choice of market-based mechanisms would provide a more effective way of dealing with environmental challenges. That view still holds sway among Conservatives in many countries. If you go to the United Kingdom, you'll find a Conservative Party committed to the use of market-based mechanisms to deal with climate change. If you go across the ditch to New Zealand, you'll see the same thing. Conservatives who understand that price mechanisms beat direct action. And it was true in Australia, where those opposite went to the 2007 election promising to put a price on carbon pollution. And it was true until that famous tipping point in Australian politics, the one vote in the coalition party room that tipped the coalition from good economics into populism. And, Deputy Speaker, we've seen the same thing in water pricing. A terrific speech that I'd commend to the House by the Minister for Sustainability, Environment, Water, Population and Communities to the Sydney Institute last year pointed out that some commentators have suggested there's an irony in Labor being the party backing the market system. And as the Minister pointed out, when it comes to that view, it's dead wrong. It's this side of the House that has been committed to market reforms in Australia's history. It took a Labor government to put in place banking deregulation, to float the dollar, to put in place competition policy, and in the area of agriculture to get rid of the old AWB monopoly and reform drought policy. So it's not surprising that it's a Labor government that is now using market-based mechanisms, because we know that that's the best thing to do in order to preserve the interests of the most disadvantaged. And it's the most efficient way of getting to the solution. Pricing carbon is more efficient and more effective than direct action, and the same is true of putting a price on water. So in both these policy areas, we face a choice. On carbon pollution, the Coalition rejects the science and they reject the economics of putting a price on carbon pollution. They want a direct action scheme that the CSIRO have just said won't get to its goals, and that'll cost every Australian household $1,300. And when it comes to water pricing, the Coalition rejects the use of water markets. But of course, Deputy Speaker, it wasn't always this way. Moves towards water markets were enhanced when the member for Wentworth was the relevant minister under the Howard government, and when he was Leader of the Opposition, he supported carbon pricing as the most efficient way of dealing with climate change. But, Deputy Speaker, it's not just in the area of market-based reforms that this side of the House are the free marketeers. When it comes to listening to economists, it's the Gillard government that takes economic advice when it comes to preparing our budget. And when it's pointed out to the Leader of the Opposition that he can't find a single economist to back his direct action scheme, he attacks Australian economists. And when he finds that he can't find a single Treasury bureaucrat who's willing to back his election costings, he goes and attacks Treasury. Let's just go through what happens with the Coalition's election costings. When they went to the last election, the Coalition used a private accounting firm, WHK Horwath, and the member for North Sydney said at the time that the two accountants from that firm had certified, quote, in law that our numbers are accurate. He told ABC Radio in November 2010, if the fifth biggest accounting firm in Australia signs off on our numbers, it's a brave person to start saying there's accounting tricks. And he said, I tell you, it's audited. This is an audited statement. The member for Goldstein strongly vouched for the costings. He said, quote, they're as good as you can get in the country, including in Treasury. But in fact, Deputy Speaker, we now know that that document was a one-page report produced 2 days out from the election. And it was the result of a carefully worded agreement between the accountants and the Coalition to produce work that would be primarily not of an audit nature. As Peter Martin pointed out in the Sydney Morning Herald last December, that led to 2 $5,000 fines plus cost orders for the accountants that had prepared these dodgy costings for the Coalition. So you'd think that the Coalition, after all of that, would take a deep breath. They'd say, well, clearly using private accounting firms didn't work for us last time. We have the $11 billion black hole. And for a little while, it did actually look as though the Coalition were going to do that. A bipartisan parliamentary report on the Parliamentary Budget Office backed in by the member for Higgins and by Senator Joyce. But it was only when they realised that they had a hole in their costings, a hole that of course emerges when you're the kind of opposition leader who says yes to every special interest and no to every tax increase, that the Coalition decided they had to back away from a Parliamentary Budget Office. So they backed away from a Parliamentary Budget Office in what I have to say, Deputy Speaker, is one of the most extraordinary late-night debates I've been involved in this place. The members for Goldstein and McKellar began attacking the institution of Treasury and Treasury Secretary Ken Henry, who was, as members know, appointed by Treasurer Costello to that position. The member for McKellar said, quote, this Parliamentary Budget Office is something that is simply linked to the coattails of Treasury. Went on to say, I made the point that Treasury and the head of Treasury had been rewarded for things they had done to assist the government. Member for Goldstein said very boldly of his costings at the last election, there was no black hole. This was a politicised black hole. It was something fabricated with the use of Treasury officials to give the government a political advantage. And these outrageous attacks on a great Australian who has served Australian economic policy making extraordinarily well, and on a great government department that has done valuable work in producing good economic policy, was what we've seen from those opposite. When those opposite are faced with an independent Treasury who finds an $11 billion black hole in their costings, they go and attack Treasury. Deputy Speaker, those opposite are like a rich kid who, when his maths teacher says, no, I think you've got a question wrong here, goes to the principal and said, can we get the maths teacher sacked, please? They're all noblesse oblige. They're all, if our economics is wrong, let's go and attack the economists. But of course, Deputy Speaker, these days, those opposite are probably wishing they had a black hole as small as $11 billion. Their black hole is now $70 billion. That's the equivalent of stopping the pension for 2 years, stopping Medicare payments for 4 years. And of course, it's not just me pointing this out. The opposition leader likes to visit various Canberra-based businesses, but when he visited CRT Building Supplies, he got a little more than he bargained for. Steve Bailey, who I'd like to point out is not a member of the Greens or the Labor Party, heckled Mr Abbott about his $70 billion black hole. He said, quote, I think he doesn't care for the people on low incomes. He cares about people like Gina Rinehart and Clive Palmer. He's out for the big boys, not for little people like us. It's a media opportunity for him. It's a stunt with no substance. The Leader of the Opposition is happy to use my constituents as a political backdrop for his media stunts. He's happy to go along to local schools and trash Australia without once mentioning that he's voted against the new school buildings that he's probably sitting in at the time. And it's Canberrans who would suffer most if the Coalition were to win office. Member for North Sydney likes talking about the 12,000 Canberra public servants he'd make redundant. Originally, he liked to say this was through natural attrition, but he's given up that one lately. He's now talking about getting rid of whole departments. Department of Climate Change is under the chopping block. Department of Health, the member for North Sydney says there's 5,000 people there and he doesn't know what they do. Well, there's two answers to that. The first thing is he could ask the Leader for the Opposition, who was the Minister for Health when the Howard government was in office and when the Department of Health also employed 5,000 public servants. Or he could actually pay some serious policy interest into the things the Department of Health are doing. I'm just waiting, Deputy Speaker, for the member for North Sydney to have his Rick Perry moment. You know, I'd like to get rid of 3 departments. Department of Climate Change, Department of Health and that other one that I can't quite remember right now. But I'm sure the member for North Sydney will think of a 3rd department to get rid of. It is deeply ironic, Deputy Speaker, that the member for North Sydney is out there speaking about job security, speaking about the Australian economy. If he's interested in job security, he might want to have a good, hard talk to the 12,000 public servants that he intends to make redundant. But frankly, Deputy Speaker, they're still $70 billion short, even after firing those 12,000 public servants. And so, frankly, they need to find some other way of getting there. The Shadow Minister for Immigration has suggested a novel way of getting there. He has decided that when he's going to get costings done, rather than go to accounting firms, he'll go to catering firms. It was catering firms that did the opposition's costings for Nauru. And I think this is an innovative scheme. Might well get the opposition there. McDonald's may well have some interest in costing the opposition's health policy. And it really does reflect much of what those opposite think about budgets. They think that government is an all-you-can-eat. You can just go out there and you can have it all. You can eat everything. Worry about dieting tomorrow. Worry about where the money's going to come from tomorrow. And we've also seen, Deputy Speaker, in recent days, a really troubling development. We've seen the abandonment of counter-cyclical fiscal policy by those opposite. Those opposite have now said that they would not have put the Commonwealth budget into debt during a downturn. And it is very clear what that would have meant, Deputy Speaker. A no-debt position means that when your revenue write-downs come, and let's not forget that 2/3 of the debt that Australia took on in the global financial crisis was revenue write-downs, not stimulus. When your revenue write-downs come, you're going to pull government back. You're not only going to fail to prop up the private sector, you're going to do exactly what the private sector is doing. You're going to follow them down into the downturn. We've got a precedent for that. It's Herbert Hoover in the Great Depression. And it's why the Great Depression wasn't a momentary blip lasting a year or two, but lasted a full decade. But those opposite now are the Herbert Hoovers of economic policy. It's no great surprise, really. They are led by somebody who, in the words of one of his predecessors, John Hewson, is genuinely innumerate. As John Hewson says, he has no interest in economics and no feeling for it. Or to take another coalition scion, Peter Costello. Speaking of the Leader of the Opposition, he said, never one to be held back by the financial consequences of decisions, he had grandiose plans for public expenditure. Another former cabinet colleague of the Leader of the Opposition said, he's just spend, spend, spend. And another said he never really understood the meaning of fiscal conservatism. Those opposite are constantly out there with their economically illiterate plans, and they are constantly out there talking down the economy. The Australian economy now enjoys gold-plated AAA credit ratings from the 3 major agencies. When was the last time that happened? Well, it's never happened before. This is the first time in Australia's history that we have enjoyed the gold-plated AAA credit rating from every government agency. So when you hear those opposite speaking about the state of the Australian economy, trash-talking the Australian economy, trying to damage consumer confidence, it is important to remember what they say overseas. When the opposition leader leaves this country, he says Australia has serious bragging rights. Compared to most developed countries, our economic circumstances are enviable. That's absolutely true, Deputy Speaker, and I only wish that they'd say it when they're back in Australia.